This is the third version of this video that I've made. I have not been satisfied with the previous two. Hopefully I will not do this again. So those of you who started to watch this, I apologize because I've taken it down repeatedly. Okay, so addressing Aristotle, and these are his numbers. You hopefully, those of you who are in the class, have seen the Socratica, a little short, less than 6 minute long biographical sketch of Aristotle. I'm not going to do a lot of that sort of thing. Just going to go through his thought primarily. I do want to say I am personally a student of Aquinas and the writings of Thomas Aquinas. I have the little 2-volume set of his Summa Theologicae. The full thing is like 40 some. The standard version of it is 8 volumes. And he is considered to be the preeminent interpreter in the Western world from a Judeo-Christian perspective of Aristotle. There were some Muslim interpreters of Aristotle as well. And so his terminology for Aristotle is always the philosopher. Whenever you read a statement by Aquinas where he speaks of the philosopher, that means Aristotle. And interestingly, there are people in the world of philosophy, in my world, who are atheists and Aristotelian who would consider themselves to be Thomistic, interpreting Aristotle through the lens of Aquinas, which is kind of fascinating. But the philosopher. And so he's got a very broad influence, and part of that is because of how broadly he wrote and taught. He addressed more things than Socrates did. Socrates especially speaks to ethics, and Plato therefore writes primarily in the field of ethics, but Aristotle addresses everything. So this is a little aside. Alexander is his student, as you heard. He's the son of Philip of Macedon, and Aristotle's brought in to teach and train him. And as you know, Alexander goes on to become this world conqueror, and Alexander the Great, and he founds a city in Egypt by the name of Alexandria on the Mediterranean Sea, and it becomes a haven for Jews during that time. It's about the 4th and then into the 3rd century BC. And in Alexandria, those Jews lose their ability to speak Hebrew, and they do want Hebrew scriptures, and ultimately what happens is that there's either 70 or 72 scholars. That's why you see the LXX, the 70. That's the Septuagint translation of the Old Testament, and it's there after Alexander has died that the Old Testament is translated into Greek, and it's that Greek version of the Old Testament that's used in quite a number of our New Testament writings when they're quoting from the Old Testament. So you could say indirectly Aristotle had an influence on the coming about of the existence of the Septuagint, because the desire to bring a unity amongst the people, the Mycenaean peoples, the Greek peoples, to spread the Hellenistic thought process and Hellenistic language or Greek language, was one of the things it had an effect of doing, was to bring about a Greek translation of the Old Testament. You heard about him having a school after he was done with teaching Alexander. He went back to Athens, where Plato's school, the Academy, had been, and he opens his own school called the Lyceum. And something that's kind of unique about that is peripatetic learning, walking and talking and processing in the learning process. And fascinatingly, that's something that's like on a front burner today, pedagogy-wise, especially being spoken of, interestingly, in the field of medical education. And there's perhaps some effects of the research of Francine Shapiro, the developer of EMDR, that has to do with eye movement as we walk, that maybe help to explain why this way of learning is so helpful. But apparently walking, talking, processing is a really good way of learning things, and he was certainly a good teacher. And so he addresses metaphysics quite a bit, which metaphysics meaning what's it all about? What's really going on in the real world? And so remember that Plato is got to deal with the idea of there being flux and change, but also there being that which remains the same. He's inheriting a situation, I really didn't unpack this in the video on Plato. Heraclitus, these are two giants in the pre-Socratic world of philosophy, and Heraclitus is all about flux and change, and he's the one who famously says you never step into the same river twice, meaning the river's always flowing. Parmenides, on the other hand, thinks that change is an illusion, and in fact there really isn't change. And these two ideas they clash with one another, but they correspond to realities that we find in our world, that there has to be that which remains the same, and yet there's always flux. And so for Plato, the way that he dealt with that which is the realm which is in flux is this world, this place where we live. But in the world of the forms, there's stasis. It's not moving all the time. And I said to you that kind of corresponds to some biblical thinking. Let me just show you from Psalm 46 what I mean by that. So all of the superscriptions to the Psalms are in our oldest copies of them. So I've included this here. For the music director, a psalm of the sons of Korah, set to Alamoth, a song. So here's the first verse, or the first strophe. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in time of trouble, is the way I know. I know it in the King James. And therefore we will not fear, though the earth shakes and the mountains slip into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, and though the mountains quake at its swelling pride. And our best guess as to what Selah means is pause, think, meditate on, contemplate all this. Contemplate the world in upheaval. So we've got this picture of earth shaking, mountains slipping into the heart of the sea, waters roaring and foaming, mountains quaking, and then this, verses 4 and 5. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, or make the city of God happy, the holy dwelling places of the Most High. God is in the midst of her, she will not be moved. So you can see verses 1 through 3 are the realm of flux. Verses 4 and 5 speak of the realm of stasis. So you can see why there might be some correspondence between some of the thoughts of the world of the forms in Plato and some Judeo-Christian thought processes. So Aristotle is Plato's leading student, but he departs from his master's teachings and he takes them in a more practical and commonsensical direction. It needs to be said that he does think form remains, form is unchanging, and he's dealing with form and matter. But he undoes the metaphysical dualism of Plato and he unites the world of the forms and our world. So the forms are right here in this world in Aristotle. And not only did he reject Plato's epistemological dualism, but maybe you remember, Plato didn't think we learned anything through our senses, that all real knowledge comes through reasoning, through thinking. And so he actually went all the way and became an empiricist. Nothing's in the mind that isn't first in the senses. And over time, much later, John Locke will speak about this and speak about the human brain being a tabula rasa, the brain of an infant being a tabula rasa, or a blank tablet, upon which experience writes what we know. As well, Aristotle moved away from the anthropological dualism. Plato thought that the soul was the prison house, or the body was the prison house of the soul. So this separation of soul and body, and he espouses a body-soul unity, which sounds, and I need to say this, it's on the surface, much like the Hebrew idea of the nephesh. God, in chapter 2 of Genesis, breathes into the man that he's formed, and he becomes a living nephesh, a living soul. And so the Hebrew understanding of human beings is not, I was taught when I was a young Christian, that we are a little trinity. We're body, soul, and spirit. That's not the Old Testament view of us. The Old Testament view is that there is that which is non-physical and there's that which is physical, and it's a unity. It's our nephesh. It's my me. It's your me, yourself. And when we talk about body, soul, and spirit, there's a place in 1 Thessalonians 5 where that terminology is used. And then also in Hebrews 4 it talks about separating even to the piercing even to the dividing asunder of soul and spirit, joints and marrow, discerning the thoughts and intentions of the heart, and so on. We think that what's going on in those places is a piling up of terms to describe a human being, like, you shall love the Lord with all your heart and soul and mind and strength. That's what's going on when we see body, soul, and spirit. So the majority position across time in the church, East and West, is what we call dichotomous, not trichotomous. Most Christians have believed across time that we are body and soul. And if you want to see what's meant by this, you can get yourself the old reference work, Trench and Girdlestone's synonyms of the Greek New Testament, and you'll find that the word psyche for soul and the word pneuma for spirit are actually synonyms. And Trench and Girdlestone demonstrate that they're used in the New Testament interchangeably, and also in Greek language they were interchangeable. So Aristotle wrote in all areas. He engaged the sciences and the humanities, as well as the social sciences and philosophy proper. He wrote on anatomy, aesthetics, astronomy, biology, epistemology, ethics, logic, metaphysics, physics, political theory, and rhetoric. Now, he's really big on logic. Although logic is definitely there and being used by Socrates and recorded by Plato, it's Aristotle who really formulates the correspondence theory of truth, for instance. It is there, a concept of truth, that something very much like this in Plato, but when we read in his categories and we read in his metaphysics and we read in his book called Of Interpretation, we find that in all three of those places he speaks to this effect. If we say of what is that it is, or of what is not that it is not, we speak truth. But if we say of what is that it is not, or of what is not that it is, then we speak falsehood. He also is, in book 4 of his Metaphysics, he gives us really the classic definition of the law of non-contradiction. Now, he didn't invent the law of non-contradiction. It's already there, and it certainly is in Plato, but he formulates it, he explains it. And so logic is really important to him. And he's concerned with logic as to the validity of statements. When we're saying something, is what we're saying correct? Is it accurate? He's concerned with how we think. So he gets into categories as far as the way that we might think about a thing or a person. Here's Nash, and he's using the categories that come to us from Aristotle to speak about Socrates. Socrates is a human being. That means his body. He is a man, a, meaning one, singular. That's quantity. He's short, rotund, and bald. That's the quality of the man, as opposed to tall and slim and having a full head of hair. He's in prison. That's the place that he's located. He's the husband of Xanthippe. That's his relation. He has a son as well that he speaks of. And I always kind of wonder, what kind of a nickname might Xanthippe have had? Because that's a pretty interesting first name. He's alive in 400 BC, so that's time. That's a year just before his death. 399 BC is when he's put to death. And then he is standing. That's his posture. And he's dressed. That's his state, as opposed to being naked. Ultimately, he's drinking hemlock. That's his action. And here he says Socrates is infuriating. This category is passion or passivity, but doesn't mean to be passive in the sense of not doing anything. It means the idea of the affective. And so when we're describing a person or a thing, it could be that we talk about it having affect or emotion, or we could have talk about the effect that it has on us emotionally. And he often did have the effect on people of being infuriating, thus them calling him the gadfly. So he distinguishes between the non-essential. Let's go back here just for a second. I want to say, in Genesis, in chapter 2, after God has made Adam and before he makes Eve, he brings all the animals before Adam, and whatever Adam calls them, that is their name. Human beings are the kind of creatures that are always involved in taxonomy. We do make a mistake in thinking that because we've hung a name on something, we understand it oftentimes. But we are the sort of creature that feels a need to name things. And as we go forward, and we are in the world of biology and zoology, it will be the impulse that comes from Aristotle that causes biologists to speak in terms of the domain, of the kingdom, the phylum, the class, the order, the family, the genus, and the species of animals. And so this is coming from him. He wants to speak well, he wants to reason well. So he distinguishes, this is metaphysics. This is what's really going on. And so he's concerned with form and matter, just like Socrates was. And he distinguishes between the non-essential characteristics of a thing and the essential characteristics. To be canine, with all that that includes, is the substance of a particular dog. But to be large and brown is the accident of one dog. So downstairs in my house right now, there is a little dog named Millie, who's black and has a white muzzle, and she's part rat terrier and she's part chihuahua. She's teeny tiny, might weigh 8 pounds. There's another dog that weighs 80 pounds, whose name is Bailey, and she's honey-colored and has white markings on her muzzle and on her feet. And she is half Rhodesian Ridgeback, and she's half Boxer. Okay, so the accidents of those dogs are the differences between them, but both Millie and Bailey have the substance of being dog. They have the form of being a dog. For Aquinas, this is important. Now, remember I said Aquinas becomes the primary interpreter of Aristotle to the West. For Aquinas, this would be important because he said that the elements of the Lord's Supper, he's trying to explain the Lord's Supper and deal with the accusations that there's this can't really be going on. It certainly doesn't feel like it is. That when we're partaking of the Lord's Supper, we're actually partaking of Jesus' body and blood. So you should know in Christianity, Roman Catholics and Lutherans believe that we really partake physically of the body and blood of Christ. Other folks, both Baptists and Reformed folks, some Baptists and Reformed folks, believe in what's called, and some Anglicans, the real presence. That although Christ isn't physically present in the elements, he's especially present with us when we partake of the Lord's Supper. And then there's also those Christians who hold to what's called memorialism. So it's just all it is a remembrance, and there's nothing unique going on. But in Catholicism, the charge that this is irrational, it doesn't fit with my experience, the way Aquinas defended the Mass actually being Jesus' body and blood is this. He used Aristotelian categories. He said that the elements of the Lord's Supper were wafer, they call it the host, that's from Latin hostia, which means victim. They were wafer and wine as to their accidens, like those differences between the dogs, but body and blood of Christ as to their substance, like the dogs both having dogginess. His maxim or limerick about this was, here beneath these signs, the accidens, are hidden priceless things, to sense forbidden, our senses can't get hold of it, signs, not the things themselves, are all we see. Nevertheless, the claim is that we are really receiving, if you're a Roman Catholic, the body and blood of Christ if you're partaking of the Lord's Supper. So he's using Aristotle to explain this and do this. And this became the theology of the Roman Catholic Church. We call this transubstantiation. The Lutheran version is slightly different, but not significantly, and it's called consubstantiation. Okay, so let me illustrate this one more time. So when I was in Bible college years ago, I had a friend from India named Raju, a friend from Kenya named Juma, and I had a friend from Korea by the name of Young Oak. So Raju was from southern India, Juma was from Nairobi, and Young Oak was from Seoul. And if I have them sitting together with me in the living room, I can only see their accidents, their individual characteristics, and the same with them looking at me as being a Caucasian man. I cannot visibly see their common humanity, their subsidence, but I certainly believe it's there, and I do make real contact with it. So all four of us are interacting as human beings, but our humanity lies beneath the surface of the accidents of the differentiations in us with regard to skin and hair and eyes and all those sorts of things. So this is still dealing with the issue that Socrates was dealing with and that Plato is addressing with form and matter in the world of the forms, and that's the issue of change. How can we have change? I just would remind you of the ugly duckling. Remember that you learn this story when you're a little child, but this one little duck seems to be ugly and doesn't seem to fit with all the others, out of place and criticized and made fun of, and can't find its place, but that's because the form of this little creature is ultimately a great, beautiful swan. And so change is in the process of taking place, and eventually we're going to find out that he's not this ugly duckling that we think he is. And so this form and matter issue is an ongoing concern for Aristotle, just like it was for Plato, and he wants to explain the causes for things. How do they get to be what they are? So this is really metaphysics going on here. We're doing this ultimate reality. He has four causes for any thing, person, or event. There's the material, the formal, the efficient, and the final. The material cause is the stuff of which a thing is made, and Nash uses the example of a table typically being made of wood. The formal cause is the idea or the blueprint of a thing. And so, the maker of the table had an idea exactly of what they wanted to create. With a soccer ball, the leather is the matter, and typically a bladder now in these days that can be inflated with air on the inside. But the spheroid shape is the form. So matter and form. The efficient cause is the actualizing cause. It's what brings it about. The carpenter makes the table, and before these things were being made by machines, when we're making a soccer ball by hand, you have to take the bladder and then sew a skin around the outside of it and sew it up with much the same skills one would have used in the past for making shoes, sewing leather. The final cause is the purpose of a thing. So the dinner table is for eating meals on, and of course the soccer ball is for playing soccer with. Now, building a ship. This is used in Aristotle, but I'm getting it a little bit more particular. So the material cause of building the ship are the wood, the nails, the screws and fasteners, ropes, sails, other supplies from which the boat is constructed. Got to have caulking. You got to seal the hull somehow, maybe with fiberglass. The formal cause, the design plans for the ship. They may be formal like blueprints, or when it's multi-generational shipwrights, they existed in the minds of great-grandpa, and then of grandpa, and then of dad, and now they're in the mind of the current one who's building the ship. When I say men for those things, that's not a sexist statement, that's just reality. I've worked up and down the coast of Maine in a small business dealing with shipwrights. I've never met a female shipwright. That's not to say a woman couldn't do it, it's just I've only ever met men. Okay, so going on, that's the formal cause, the design plans for the ship. Now, if you're in a big shipyard and they're building a yacht, there's going to be like blueprints. But in the shipbuilding that takes place when people are making it, who've made these boats across the years, it's just in the mind of the maker. The efficient cause is the shipwright and his workers. Now, here sometimes I do see wives and daughters involved in the working together with a father who's usually the organizer. And then the final cause, if it's a sailboat, is to sail on the seas. Most of the boats with which I was dealing were that they're going to be out, they're going to hauling lobsters. And so let's apply the four causes to human beings to see what's going on here. The material cause is your body, and it was an infant's body originally when it came into the world, and now it's as big as your body is now, but it's still the same, it's physical. The formal cause is your soul in Aristotle, what gives shape to your body and imprints you as being human. The efficient cause is God by means of your parents. Your parents were intimate, and then God granted that life would be generated through their union, and so that's the efficient cause. And then speaking in Christian terms, especially in terms of the Westminster Shorter Catechism, what's the chief end of man, meaning of human beings? To glorify God and enjoy Him forever. So material cause body, formal cause soul, efficient cause God and mom and dad, and final cause God. Now, potentiality is what something has the ability to become. Actuality is what it is, and change is flux. So any change with regard to a place is locomotion, such as I pick up a chair and I move it into the other room. Any change with regard to quality is alteration. For example, something cold becomes hot. I just heated up some water to make some tea about a half hour ago, and that cold water became hot. Or something green becomes red. We paint it, or whatever. If it's on our computer, we take and we change the color of the pigment that's there, and so on. And then change with regard to quantity is either augmentation, it's getting bigger, or diminution, depending on whether the thing gets larger or smaller. And then lastly, change with substance is either generation, life, growth, or corruption, decay, depending on whether an existing substance is destroyed or a new substance comes into existence. Here are two terms in Aristotle that I find especially helpful, and most especially the latter of the two. So the ergon of a thing is what that thing does best, better than anything or anyone else. So I have taken in the past and used a pair of scissors in order to punch a hole in a leather belt. I'd lost some weight and my belt wasn't holding my pants up, and I took a hammer and I opened up the scissors and just used one of the two sides of the scissors and banged on top of it with a hammer until I pierced through the leather, and I moved it around in there until I got the hole open. I could put the clasp of the belt through that hole. But that's not what scissors are for, right? I mean, scissors I can cut and have. I can cut lettuce, or I can cut spinach, or I can cut cabbage with scissors. We have kitchen scissors, and you could cut fabric with scissors, and you could cut cardboard with scissors. But what they're better at than anything else is cutting paper. The ergon of what a thing is, what it does best. The ergon of your eye is to see. The ergon of your heart is to pump, to function like a pump. The ergon of your kidneys and of your liver are to be filters, and so on. And the ergon of a human being, according to Aristotle, is to think. We are the rational animal, he says. That's what we do better than any other creature on the planet. And so that's interesting. The ergon is an interesting idea and helpful. But to me, especially, the entelechy is the most fascinating thing, especially I think in terms of ethics, the idea that a human being is made for something, and we want to use the human organism in accordance with how it's been made. So Aristotle claimed to have identified what he called an inner urge in each living thing to realize its end or purpose, a drive to develop. Think of that ugly duckling actually becoming the swan, to become its unique self. And so, speaking this way, we can say that an acorn, for an example, has an inner urge to become an oak tree. By the way, this is from Aristotle, but you'll search Aristotle in vain to find the term acorn. He just uses the term corn, but by that he means acorn. So, if you think about it, any beautiful oak tree you've ever seen in your life originally started out life as a little tiny acorn that was planted in the ground. So the idea is that there's this inner urge within things to become what they are meant to be. They have an end in themselves. The Greek word for this is entelechy. And so this is the idea that, we have that which we're meant to be, to become. And we want to become the best version of ourselves. Believers and unbelievers speak about becoming your best self. And in terms of Christianity, think of this in terms of like Ephesians 2:10, where it says that you are his workmanship, we are his workmanship, created for good works in Christ, that he prepared beforehand for us to walk in them. So there's an entelechy of that I have a destiny, as it were, that potentially I could achieve these things and become what I was meant to be. There's also another sense of entelechy that applies to Christianly, which has to do with holiness and becoming Christ-like. And so Paul speaks about how he has not, Philippians 3, he has not yet obtained that for which God laid hold of him. But one thing he does, forgetting what lies behind and looking forward toward what lies ahead, he presses on towards the mark of the high calling of God in Christ Jesus. So he's trying to move towards becoming the best version of Paul that he can be in the service of Christ. Entelechy is kind of a fascinating idea, and it's something that I think we ought to do more with. It's something, in fact, if you wanted to do a final project that had to do with the concept of entelechy, I would definitely entertain letting you do that. Aristotle's God, the prime mover, is pure form with no matter. But it needs to be said, he's not God in any kind of sense, or the prime mover is not God in any kind of sense like unto the Judeo-Christian God. And in fact, he's totally other and different and transcendent and unable to communicate or care about human beings. And there's potentially different spheres in which there might be more than one prime mover with Aristotle's thought. But if you want to think about why he would use this term prime mover, it's that our world is in motion, and things here are in motion. And think now in terms of Newtonian physics, which will show up a whole lot later, like almost 2,000 years later after Aristotle, it'll come on the scene. But the idea that a body in motion tends to stay in motion, a body at rest tends to stay at rest. And what he's saying is something had to draw or pull. And so the prime mover is that which pulls or draws or pushes. It sets things moving. Now, when we deal with matter, that which is being moved, and in Aristotle, unfortunately, he has a problem, and his problem is an ancient one that's shared with many other pre-Socratics and ancient philosophers. For him, matter is eternal. So the prime mover is not the maker of matter and of stuff. And matter can never really be created or truly destroyed. It's like co-eternal with the prime mover. So that's definitely problematic in terms of any kind of a deity. So we're saying that it has the power of being in itself, or it has a aseity. That seems to be a non sequitur, but that is part of his view of things. Soul and mind are differentiated by him, and this permits him then to formulate the ideas of the passive and the active intellect. So I mentioned to you that it sounds like, superficially, that his idea of the soul earlier corresponded to the Hebrew idea of the nephesh, but it doesn't. And so the soul is just the form of the body for him. So the closest thing that he comes to soul is the idea of the active intellect. The passive is the ability of the mind, the brain, to take in sense datum and to comprehend it. But the active intellect is then to act upon it, to be able to synthesize from it, to be able to use imagination with it, and so on. And so if there is something like soul in Aristotle, it is the active intellect. But probably He doesn't mean by it what we mean by soul either still. We'll get to that. It's coming on the next slide, I think. He further differentiates the soul into three parts. The vegetative, and that sounds odd, but it's not the idea that we're vegetables. Vegetative or nutritive, sensitive or perceptive, and rational or reasoning. The vegetative is the idea that like with plants, that we have to take in nutrition. And so in the ancient world, they understood that too. And so there's a sense in which we're vegetative in that we have to receive nutrition. Sensitive or perceptive, it'd be something that we share with the animals. We have affect, we have feeling. And then rational or reasoning, they didn't tend to give animals the credit in the ancient world for the degree of intelligence they had. And so that's especially human. But those three things, the soul has a vegetative part, a sensitive part, and a rational part to it. If there's hope in his system for an immortal aspect of humans, it lies in the active intellect. But I think that Nash is correct that the Averroists, so the Averroists are the followers of Averroes and Avicenna, are the names of some 13th century Muslim philosophers. They're like shorthand names. The real name of Averroes is Abu al-Walid Muhammad ibn, means son of, Ahmad, ibn Muhammad, ibn Rashid. And so it's a whole lot easier to say Averroes. That he thinks it's likely that they were more accurate in their interpretation of Aristotle than Aquinas was, and that there is not in Aristotle a continuation of personal existence after death. So once you die, for Aristotle, you're dead, you're gone. So then in the world of ethics, he gives a wonderful contribution, and that's the idea of the virtues. For him, the virtues are, I want you to do something for me while you're listening to the video. Take your left hand, hold it up, and hold it out all the way to the left. Take your right hand and hold it up all the way to the right. The left hand, think of this as cowardice, and the right hand as rashness or recklessness, that would be reckless with one's life. So over here on the left is the person who's cowering in the foxhole and not doing what they need to do in order to be successful in battle, and their fellow soldiers are dying around them and they're not doing anything other than just covering themselves. Over here on the right is the one who's a little bit crazy and thinks that they're indestructible, and they charge a machine gun nest without any cover. And so that's recklessness. In between the two is courage. The person who has courage is not lacking in fear, but he or she overcomes their fear in order to do what needs to be done. We call that courage. So the virtues are, for Aristotle, they're a midpoint or a mean between an excess, recklessness, and a deficit of any quality. You can do this with whatever virtue you might think of. Honesty, you can think of the person who is blunt all the way over on the excess, and they're dishonest in the deficit, and so on. You will hear the term golden mean used to describe this. Aristotle never uses the prefix golden. It's just the midpoint or the mean. And the reason why this matters, in the 1950s, we were in a situation, since the Enlightenment, of there being only two ethical theories that were really predominant or successful, and they were utilitarianism, per Bentham and Mills, and that's the idea of the greatest good for the greatest number of people, that's how we know what's right and wrong. And then really primarily Kant's form of deontology, Immanuel Kant's idea of the categorical imperatives and duty. And so into this realm comes a young woman. She's just graduated with her undergraduate degree. She's doing some lecturing because she's a very bright student at the University of Oxford. She writes a 16-page monograph called Modern Moral Philosophy. And it's like somebody threw a bomb into the world of philosophy, and especially ethics. She blew it up. Because what had happened is Aristotle had been relegated to the junk pile of philosophy and ethics and was completely out of vogue. Nobody was reading Aristotle anymore. And when she brings out Aristotle and uses Aristotle, remember this, we're trying to do secular ethics in the Enlightenment world or in the modern world. And so secular ethics are not dependent upon a moral code like what we find in the scriptures. They're dependent upon reason. And what happens is that she kind of blows up the field of ethics, and Aristotelian thought goes to center stage. And today, when we talk about virtue ethics, when we talk about ethics of care, there's all these spin-offs from virtue ethics. It has become much bigger than the other forms of secular ethics. And so Aristotle is very much live issue as far as when we deal with his virtues in the world of ethics. He's helpful in his categories of essential versus non essential properties when it comes to the business of defending the incarnation. This is the end of the talk here. So, this is when Nash is wrapping the chapter up, and he's talking about Thomas V. Morris and the doctrine of the incarnation. So, John Hick, who had been the head of the religion department at the university that I have my PhD from, the University of Birmingham in Birmingham, England. John Hick was a pluralist, which means he believed there's many ways to God, many paths to God. And he had a number of others who wrote together with him. He was the editor of a volume called The Myth of God Incarnate. There was a response by Orthodox or evangelical theologians called The Truth, or no, excuse me, The Logic of God Incarnate. And in the book The Logic of God Incarnate, one of the things that's engaged is the claim that it's impossible for Jesus to have been both God, and fully man, although that's the Christian understanding of the person of Christ. And that's, there's battles about this in the early church as to who Christ is. And the conclusion is reached that he's fully God and fully man. In the words of the Nicene Creed, God from God, light from light, very God from very God, begotten, not made, being of one substance with the Father, through whom all things came into being, and so on. And that he was made man. And so what he does is he uses Aristotelian categories of essential versus non-essential properties to defend the incarnation. And he shows that although Jesus is divine, that doesn't make it impossible for him to be a human, which was the claim. The claim was as human beings by definition are not the things that apply to Christ's deity. And so that it's illegitimate to say that the person of Christ is fully God and fully man. And where John Hick and those guys go with it is they're using it as kind of being an analogy or a metaphor or being a helpful idea, but that it's not really true in the real world. Where Thomas V. Morris uses Aristotle to say, actually, it could easily be true in the real world. And the idea is, one of the things they say is human beings are sinful. As far as Hick's crew, human beings do wrong things, so a sinless human being couldn't be. And one of the things that Morris shows when he's making his argumentation is that, well, Adam and Eve, we think they were human beings before the fall of the race into sin. So although that it's a normative thing that human beings are sinful, it's not an essential thing. You don't have to be a sinner in order to be a human being. And so it's interesting that Aristotle can be used even down to the present day to vindicate historic Christian understanding of the person of Jesus Christ. And with that, we'll draw the lecture to an end.